In my field, political philosophy or political theory, there was a scholar named Leo Strauss who made this argument above all that there's an art of writing between the lines, esoteric writing. He explained the reasons for it, and he directed our attention to the authors who do it. So I would say almost all the great authors in political philosophy do it because they feel really keenly this responsibility to convey one thing for the public appetite and another thing for the few thinkers. Not everybody is a thinker in the sense that they want to understand the deep ins and outs of political life. So there are many different ways the authors do this. Deliberate contradiction is one. So if I say, for example, if I say somewhere one thing and then I specifically say the opposite. So some people won't even notice the contradictions. You don't have to worry about them. They just won't notice any. They don't see that anything is weird in the first place. Some other people will say, oh, look, this guy contradicted himself. He must not know what he's talking about. But sometimes there can be contradictions that were designed to be deliberate, where it's like, I left you with one impression, but if you think it through, there's another one. So it's an amazing topic in the history of political philosophy. Usually it has to do with religious belief. Many times an author has to present himself as religious, even though beneath the surface, he's more doubtful, let's say, about the role of religion in public morality. Like he's more doubtful about the truth that there's a God who reveals himself and who reveals the moral law. That can be a necessary political belief, but a dubious philosophical belief. So sometimes authors have to be less than completely honest about that. But there are others as well, for sure. So yeah, it makes it exciting because it's sort of like when you know that that's possible, then then reading becomes detective work. You really have to you can't take anything for granted. You have to try to understand what's actually going on. Plato's Laws, the book I held up earlier, is an example. It has throughout examples like that, Plato's Republic and so on. So that art of writing between the lines is a necessary, learning to read between the lines becomes a necessary skill for understanding the history of political thought.
Yeah, what you're saying makes me think of stand-up comedy and stand-up comedy podcasts. And I don't know how much or how closely you follow the American stand-up sphere, but there's a lot of podcasts and they are trying to tell jokes, in the funniest way possible, which often means committing to absurd things or, shit that's going to get you taken down from YouTube versus what you can say in a club with 200 people with their phones locked up. And there's no restriction on what you can say, whether other than is it funny or is it not. People will let you know. And I have seen stand-ups perform live around New York and your phones are locked up. And then I'll listen to a podcast with that same stand-up as a guest, or maybe they're hosting, but they're just on the episode and they're making a similar joke, but in a way that can be digested by the masses or digested by YouTube without it being flagged or taken down. But it's an incredibly, oftentimes a dirty joke or just like something you're not supposed to say outright. And they'll allude to it. Or it's not exactly the same as what it sounds like you're talking about with Leo Strauss or Plato, but there's like a subtextual way that comedians talk on podcasts that if you're paying attention, you get the joke. It just takes you're like, oh, I missed that. And you go back 15 seconds and then, you laugh like a fucking psychopath in your apartment by yourself. And then there's in a stand-up comedy club where you can just come out and say it and you don't have to worry about Netflix or YouTube or anything like that. So what you were saying just made me think about like the subtext of podcasts versus what you could say in the basement of a club.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's similar to the opening ceremony one too, because again, we can imagine an art performance that was just for 200 people versus for 200 million people, and the way that would be, it's the same similar principle. And comedians, there's something additional about the comedians that puts them into this category, which is that comics can openly laugh at things that are conventionally done or said or taken for granted. I mean, a big part of comedy, from what I understand, not so much as like somebody who watches comedy, but somebody who reads about it, is the attack on convention. So to be publicly responsible is somehow to pay lip service to the conventional beliefs. A comic is somebody who's sort of he's allowed to attack the conventional beliefs. He's given a lot of leeway. Like a comic can say the uncomfortable truths or can make, all the way from the moderate version that gets distributed on YouTube, which can still be pretty, it can still be an attack, all the way to the 200 Club, private thing. So it's an attack on convention. Why that's important, I think, for the Leo Strauss angle is because besides Plato, one of the old thinkers who sort of did this, he wrote different things in different ways to different people that were on the surface one message and beneath the surface a more serious message, was a comic playwright, and it was Aristophanes. So even classically, meaning thousands of years ago, the comedy was a vehicle for stating unpopular and uncomfortable truths with more immunity than you could do if you weren't a comic. So comics have a certain sort of immunity. They can talk about gender, they could talk about race, they could talk about all kinds of things under the protective armor of comedy. So that is very important, because that means comedy has philosophical significance because it's a form that allows you to speak about unpopular truths safely, somewhat safely, not perfectly safely, but more safely than if you weren't a comic. I think that's one of the reasons why. I don't say this is any great insight here. Maybe this is common knowledge for people who listen to contemporary comics, but a lot of people, if I'm not mistaken, turn today to comics for their political commentary because somehow the immunity that you have as a comic allows you to be more honest about what's going on in politics.
Mm-hmm.
So people isn't Dave Smith a comic that a lot of people look to for, political insight, and other people that, Joe Rogan
Smith's
himself
great,
being a comic who. So I assume that this kinship of comedy and politics concerning like truth telling in a safe way, again, safe because somehow if it's just comedy, you're protected from being like a real threat.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you can say what everybody's thinking or maybe what nobody's thinking, but should be thinking. So comedy's a part of that.